On a cold January night in 1943, in a small room on the 33rd floor of the Hotel New Yorker, an old man lay alone. He had once lit the way for entire cities. He had once made lightning that stretched for miles. And now, at 86 years old, Nikola Tesla was dying quietly, with nothing but pigeons for company and a mind still buzzing with secrets he had never told a soul. When the maid found him the next morning, the room was locked from the inside. His notebooks were gone before the sun came up. And somewhere, in a modest apartment across the city, a woman who had worked at his side for years sat by her window, wondering if she would ever be allowed to say what she knew. Her name has been spoken in whispers for decades. Some called her his secretary. Others called her his last assistant, the only person Tesla trusted enough to let inside the laboratory during the final, strange years of his life, when the world had already written him off as a forgotten genius chasing impossible ideas. For most of her life, she said nothing. She kept the silence Tesla himself had asked her to keep. But near the end of her own life, decades later in a handful of quiet conversations with people who cared enough to ask, she finally began to talk about one night in particular. A night, she said, changed the way she understood her employer forever. A night, she claimed, when they discovered something together that the world was never supposed to know. This is the story of that night, pieced together from her own recollections, from the fragments of Tesla's notebooks that survived him, and from the strange trail of evidence that the United States government tried very hard to make disappear. To understand what happened that night, you have to understand who Nikola Tesla really was, not the cartoon version of the mad scientist that pop culture likes to sell, but the real man. Tesla was born in 1856 in a small village in what is now Croatia, the son of a Serbian Orthodox priest. And from the time he was a boy, he saw the world differently than everyone around him. He didn't just imagine machines. He said he could build them completely in his mind, run them, test them, watch them fail, and fix them, all without ever touching a single tool. Only when the design was perfect in his head would he finally build it in the real world. That gift, or curse, depending on how you look at it, would define his entire life. By the time he arrived in America in 1884 with 4 cents in his pocket and a letter of recommendation, Tesla already understood something about electricity that almost no one else on the planet grasped. He believed that alternating current, not the direct current that Thomas Edison had bet his entire empire on, was the only way to truly deliver power across long distances. Edison hired him, doubted him, allegedly promised him a fortune for solving a technical problem, and then, according to Tesla, simply refused to pay when the work was done. Tesla walked away and eventually found a partner in George Westinghouse, and together they proved that alternating current could do what Edison said was impossible. The lights of the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago, and later the roaring power of Niagara Falls itself, ran on Tesla's system. He had, in every sense that mattered, won the war of the currents. And yet, strangely, he ended up poor and mostly forgotten while Edison's name became a household word. That injustice, if you can call it that, seemed to push Tesla further and further away from the world of business and further into ideas that most people considered impossible or even dangerous. He didn't just want to deliver electricity through wires anymore. He wanted to send it through the air itself, for free, to every corner of the earth. He wanted a world where anyone, anywhere, could pull unlimited power out of thin air without ever paying a cent for it. It was a beautiful idea. It was also, to the wealthy men who were funding him, an absolutely terrifying one, because a world with free energy for everyone was a world with no need for their railroads, their coal, their oil, or their fortunes. This is where Wardenclyffe comes into the story. On the north shore of Long Island, with money from the financier J.P. Morgan, Tesla built a tower that still looks strange in old photographs, a huge wooden structure crowned with a metal dome, rising nearly 200 feet into the sky. Officially, it was meant to be a wireless communication station, a way to send messages across the Atlantic without cables. But those who worked closest to Tesla, including the woman at the center of this story, always believed the tower was meant for something far bigger. They believed Tesla intended to use it to transmit not just messages, but actual electrical power, wirelessly, to any point on the globe. Construction on Wardenclyffe began in 1901. For a few years, the tower buzzed, quite literally, with activity. Workers came and went. Strange humming sounds were reported by nearby residents on certain nights. And it was into this environment, sometime in this period, that the young woman who would later become Tesla's closest and most trusted assistant first entered his life. She had been recommended to him by a mutual acquaintance, a quiet, meticulous young woman with a talent for shorthand, a steady hand for technical diagrams, and, most importantly for a man like Tesla, an almost total lack of interest in gossip. Tesla did not want an assistant who would talk. He wanted someone who understood the value of silence, and by every account she gave later in life, she took that expectation seriously for the rest of her days. In the beginning, her duties were exactly what you would expect. She managed his correspondence, which was enormous, since Tesla exchanged letters with scientists, journalists, and admirers all over the world. She organized his notes, which, by his own admission, were often chaotic, scattered across notebooks in a shorthand only he fully understood. She sat in on meetings with investors, taking notes while Tesla paced the room describing inventions that wouldn't exist for another 50 years, or in some cases, that still don't exist today. But as the months went on, and as Wardenclyffe's fortunes began to decline, her role began to change into something much more unusual. J.P., Morgan, it turned out, had pulled his financial support almost as soon as he realized what Tesla was truly trying to build. The story goes that when Morgan understood that Tesla's tower could deliver free, unlimited power to anyone on Earth, he asked the question that mattered most to a man like him. Where do we put the meter? Tesla, by his own account, didn't have a good answer because the entire point of his vision was that there wouldn't be one. Morgan withdrew his backing, other investors followed, and Wardenclyffe slowly ground to a halt, its tower standing unfinished and increasingly abandoned on the Long Island shoreline. But here is where the story that Tesla's assistant told, late in her life, begins to diverge from the official history that most textbooks repeat. According to her, work at Wardenclyffe did not simply stop the moment the money disappeared. Tesla kept a small skeleton crew there for months afterward, working at night, largely in secret, funded out of his own dwindling pocket. And she said that she was one of only a handful of people who were ever allowed inside during that final, quiet period when Tesla was no longer trying to impress investors and had nothing left to lose. She described those nights as unlike anything else in her time working for him. Tesla, she said, seemed almost relieved once the money and the pressure of public expectation were gone. Without investors looking over his shoulder, he stopped trying to build something that would be commercially useful and started chasing an idea that had apparently been sitting in the back of his mind for years, something he had hinted at in earlier notebooks but had never dared to pursue openly. She never used the exact scientific language he used, since she admitted she didn't always fully understand it herself, but she remembered him talking about resonance, about the Earth itself acting like a kind of enormous imperfect conductor, and about vibrations that could, in theory, be tuned to travel through the ground itself rather than through the air. On the particular night she eventually spoke about, she said Tesla asked her to stay unusually late. It was autumn, cold enough that her breath fogged in the unheated parts of the laboratory building. Tesla had spent the better part of that week adjusting something deep inside the tower's base, a set of coils and grounding rods that ordinary visitors never saw, hidden beneath the structure in a section that even most of his remaining workers weren't permitted to enter. She said he was unusually quiet that evening, the kind of quiet that came over him only when he was on the edge of something he considered important. According to her recollection, Tesla asked her to record his readings that night, numbers from instruments she didn't fully understand, dials and gauges that fluctuated in ways she said she had never seen before, even after years of watching him work. And then, sometime after midnight, he asked her to step outside with him, away from the tower itself, out toward the open field nearby. She said the ground felt strange beneath her feet, and Tesla told her not to be alarmed that the vibration was intentional, that it was the entire point of what he was testing. She described a faint hum that seemed to rise not from the tower above them, but from the earth itself, a sensation more than a sound, something she felt in her chest and in the soles of her shoes before she ever consciously heard it. And then she said, something happened that she had never spoken about publicly until she was very old, something she said she had promised Tesla she would keep to herself for as long as he lived, and for a long time afterward out of respect for his memory. She described a brief, localized flash of light, not from the tower, but from a metal fence post some distance away, as if the energy had somehow traveled underground and surfaced at that exact point. She said Tesla did not seem surprised. If anything, he seemed satisfied, almost like a man confirming something he had already worked out in his head long before he ever tested it in the real world. He told her, in words she remembered clearly even decades later, that the ground was, in his words, alive with possibility, and that, if he was right, distance itself would eventually become meaningless for the transmission of power. Now, it's important to slow down here and be honest about something. This story exists almost entirely because one woman, very late in her life, chose to share a handful of memories with people who were willing to listen. There is no surviving official laboratory report describing that specific night in detail. Tesla's own notebooks from that period are famously incomplete, partly because Tesla himself was inconsistent about what he wrote down, and partly because a significant portion of his papers vanished after his death, seized by government agents within hours of his passing, under the justification of national security during wartime. Historians still argue about exactly what was in those confiscated files, and the government's own released summaries, decades later, insisted there was nothing revolutionary in them at all. But those who find her story compelling point to something curious, Tesla did, in fact, spend the rest of his life circling back to very similar ideas. In interviews given years after Wardenclyffe was abandoned and eventually torn down for scrap during the First World War to help pay off his debts, Tesla continued to insist that the Earth itself could be used as a medium for transmitting both signals and power, a concept scientists today generally associate with a real measurable phenomenon known as the Schumann resonance, the natural electromagnetic hum that circles the Earth between its surface and the ionosphere. That phenomenon wasn't formally described and measured by mainstream science until the 1950s, years after Tesla's death. If his assistant's account is accurate, it would suggest Tesla had already brushed up against this idea decades earlier, quietly, in a field outside an abandoned tower, with only one witness beside him. It's also worth remembering that Tesla was not a man prone to modesty about his discoveries when he believed they were real. He announced earthquake machines. He claimed he could split the Earth in half if he wished, a claim that sounds absurd until you learn it was rooted in real, if wildly exaggerated, experiments he conducted with mechanical resonance in his lab. Experiments that reportedly did cause small tremors and cracked pipes in the building where he worked. He spoke openly, sometimes recklessly, about wireless power, about death rays he insisted were defensive weapons meant to end all war, about picking up mysterious signals he believed might have come from another planet. If Tesla genuinely believed he had unlocked a new way to move power through the ground itself, it seems strange that a man so famous for grand, sweeping public claims would have kept this particular discovery completely silent for the rest of his life. And yet, according to his assistant, that is exactly what he did. She said that in the days following that night, Tesla became noticeably more guarded, not less. He didn't rush to tell reporters. He didn't file for new patents describing what they had observed. Instead, she said, he asked her to destroy her own personal shorthand notes from that specific evening, keeping only the technical instrument readings, stripped of any narrative description of what they had actually witnessed outside. When she asked him why, she said he told her that some knowledge was more dangerous in the wrong hands than useful in the right ones, and that he had already lost enough sleep worrying about what certain men might do with unlimited, ungoverned power. It's a haunting quote, if it's accurate, and it fits with things Tesla is known to have said elsewhere. In his later years, especially after witnessing the beginnings of 2 world wars fought partly over resources and energy, Tesla grew increasingly cautious about who he shared his more radical ideas with. He turned down lucrative offers. He avoided certain government contacts. He reportedly told at least one interviewer that he sometimes regretted publishing certain ideas too early in his career, ideas that he believed had been picked up and twisted by others for purposes he never intended. Whether or not you believe every detail of his assistant's account, there is no serious dispute that Tesla's final decades were strange, isolated, and full of half-finished ideas that he refused to fully explain to anyone. He lived out his last years largely alone in hotel rooms, feeding pigeons in the park, occasionally receiving reporters who came hoping for one more incredible headline before he died. He gave interviews on his birthdays that grew stranger and more grandiose with each passing year, claims about death rays, about contact with other worlds, about power beamed across oceans, that the press mostly treated as the eccentric ramblings of a man whose greatest days were long behind him. But his assistant, in her own account, insisted that his mind never actually declined the way people assumed. She said that behind closed doors, away from reporters looking for a sensational quote, Tesla remained precise, focused, and quietly working on ideas. He had simply stopped trying to explain to a world that had already decided he was finished. She described him in his final years not as a broken man, but as a patient one, someone who had made peace with the idea that his most important work might not be recognized in his own lifetime, and who had, in a strange way, accepted that some of what he knew might simply die with him. That brings us back to the night at the tower and to the question that has kept this particular story alive among Tesla researchers and enthusiasts for years. If Tesla really did discover a working method for transmitting power through the ground itself, even in a crude early form, what happened to that knowledge? Did it die with him in that hotel room in January of 1943? Did it disappear into the boxes of documents that federal agents removed from his belongings within hours of his death? Documents that were eventually reviewed and, according to official statements, found to contain nothing of significant scientific value, a conclusion that plenty of historians and engineers over the years have found difficult to fully accept, given everything else we know about the man. Or did a small piece of that knowledge survive, after all, tucked away for decades in the memory of a woman who kept her promise of silence far longer than almost anyone could have expected, choosing to speak only when she felt she was near the end of her own life, and perhaps felt that the story deserved to exist somewhere outside her own memory before it was too late. It's worth stepping back here and being honest about the limits of what can actually be verified. Stories like this one exist in a strange space between history and legend, kept alive by fragments, by secondhand recollections, by a man whose real achievements were already so extraordinary that it becomes easy to believe almost anything about him. Tesla invented the foundation of the alternating current power system that runs nearly every home on Earth today. He pioneered radio technology years before Marconi received public credit for it, a dispute the United States Supreme Court eventually settled years after Tesla's death, largely in Tesla's favor. He described, in broad strokes, technologies that wouldn't become real until decades later, from radar to wireless communication devices that sound remarkably like the smartphones sitting in almost everyone's pocket today. Given a track record like that, it's not hard to understand why so many people are willing to believe he might have quietly discovered one more thing that the rest of the world simply wasn't ready for. At the same time, it's important to hold on to a bit of healthy skepticism. Memory, especially memory recalled many decades after the fact, is not a perfect recording device. Stories grow and shift with each retelling, shaped by the storyteller's own feelings about the person they're describing, and shaped too by everyone who repeats the story afterward, each adding a small detail here, smoothing over a gap there until the story that survives may look quite different from whatever actually happened on that cold night outside an abandoned tower on Long Island. That doesn't necessarily mean the core of the story is false, but it's a reminder that we're dealing with legend as much as we're dealing with verified history. And the two are not always easy to separate, especially with a figure as mythologized as Tesla. What we do know for certain is this: Nikola Tesla spent the last years of his life largely alone, protective of his remaining ideas, distrustful of the institutions and men of power who had disappointed him again and again throughout his career. We know that a significant portion of his private papers disappeared into government custody almost immediately after his death, and that the full contents of those files were not disclosed to the public for decades, feeding decades of speculation about what might have been hidden inside. We know that Tesla continued until the very end of his life to insist that he had solved problems the rest of the scientific world considered impossible, even as fewer and fewer people were willing to take him seriously. And we know that at least one person who worked closely beside him during those final years chose to carry a particular memory in silence for most of her life, only speaking of it when she felt the time had finally come. Maybe that night at Wardenclyffe really was exactly what she described. A quiet, private glimpse of a discovery decades ahead of its time, deliberately buried by a man who feared what the world might do with it. Or maybe it was something smaller than legend has made it, a strange but explainable electrical phenomenon, misremembered and reshaped over the passing decades into something far more dramatic than it ever actually was. The truth, at this point, may be permanently out of reach, buried somewhere between a locked hotel room in 1943, a stack of confiscated documents that the public has never fully seen, and the fading memory of a woman who kept a promise for most of her life before finally deciding to share it. What remains in the end is the same thing that has always defined Nikola Tesla's legacy: a mixture of undeniable genius and unanswered questions, of real world-changing achievements sitting right alongside claims that still can't be fully proven or fully dismissed. He gave the world alternating current, radio, and the beginnings of wireless technology, and then he spent his final years chasing ideas so far ahead of their time that even his own biographers still argue about where the man's brilliance ended and the myth around him began. There's another layer to this story worth sitting with, and it has less to do with Tesla himself and more to do with why a tale like this endures at all, nearly a century after his death. Tesla occupies a strange place in the popular imagination, somewhere between historical figure and folk hero. Unlike Edison, who built an empire and a brand that has survived intact for well over a century, Tesla died poor, alone, and largely unrecognized by the public of his own time. That gap between his genius and his ending is exactly the kind of gap that legends love to fill. When a brilliant man dies quietly, leaving behind confiscated notebooks and unanswered questions, people naturally start wondering what might have been in those notebooks, and it becomes very easy for private conversations, secondhand memories, and educated guesses to slowly harden into something that feels like established fact, even when the documentary evidence remains thin. This is not unique to the story of his assistant and that night at Wardenclyffe. Tesla's name has been attached to earthquake machines, to secret weapons supposedly powerful enough to end wars in an instant, to claims that his death ray research was seized and weaponized by governments around the world, and even to theories linking him to unexplained events like the Tunguska explosion in Siberia in 1908, a massive blast that flattened millions of trees with no confirmed cause to this day. None of these claims have ever been proven with hard, verifiable evidence, and serious historians treat most of them with heavy skepticism. But they persist, generation after generation, because Tesla's real accomplishments were so far ahead of his era that the line between what he actually did and what people wish he had done has become blurred almost beyond repair. That's part of what makes his assistant's story so compelling to the people who have kept it alive over the years. It doesn't ask you to believe in death rays or secret weapons. It's a smaller, quieter kind of claim, a private moment between two people in a field. a subtle sensation felt through the ground rather than a dramatic demonstration of destructive power. In some ways, that restraint is exactly what makes it feel more believable to many who've heard it, since it lacks the theatrical excess of some of the wilder Tesla legends. It reads less like a tall tale designed to impress an audience, and more like an honest, if imperfect, memory carried by someone who had no particular reason to lie, and in fact spent most of her life choosing not to talk about it at all. Researchers who have spent years digging through what remains of Tesla's surviving papers point out that his notebooks from the Wardenclyffe period do contain scattered references to grounding experiments, to Earth currents, and to ideas about using the planet itself as part of a much larger electrical circuit. These references are fragmentary, technical, and often maddeningly incomplete, more like notes to himself than any kind of polished record meant for someone else to understand later. But they do exist, preserved in archives and occasionally referenced in academic papers about the history of early wireless power research. Whether those scattered notes describe the exact night his assistant remembered, or simply reflect years of ongoing experimentation, of which that particular night might have been only one small part, is something no one has been able to answer with certainty. What can be said with more confidence is that the broader scientific community eventually caught up, at least partially, with some of the ideas Tesla was circling during those final years at Wardenclyffe. The discovery and formal measurement of the Schumann resonance in the 1950s confirmed that the Earth and its atmosphere really do behave, in certain respects, like an enormous natural electrical cavity, capable of sustaining very low-frequency waves that circle the globe continuously. Modern researchers studying extremely low-frequency communication, technology still used today by militaries around the world to communicate with submarines deep underwater, rely on principles that echo, at least in spirit, the kind of thinking Tesla was reportedly exploring at Wardenclyffe decades before the underlying physics was properly understood or accepted by mainstream science. None of this proves that Tesla achieved wireless power transmission through the ground in any practical, repeatable sense. Most engineers who have studied his surviving designs believe that even if his underlying intuition about the Earth's electrical properties was pointed in a genuinely interesting direction, the technology of his era, and arguably even the technology of today, was nowhere near capable of transmitting meaningful amounts of usable power this way over any significant distance without enormous, impractical losses. Physics has its limits, and enthusiasm for a beloved historical figure doesn't erase them. But being technically limited in his own time doesn't mean Tesla wasn't touching on something real. Plenty of scientific ideas take decades or even centuries to move from a rough intuition to a workable technology. And history is full of examples of ideas dismissed as impossible in one era, becoming ordinary, everyday reality in another. So where does that leave us, all these decades later, with a story built on the memory of one woman who kept her silence for most of her life? Perhaps it leaves us exactly where Tesla himself seemed most comfortable living, in that uncertain space between proven fact and tantalizing possibility, where genius and myth blur together until it becomes almost impossible to fully separate the two. He built an entire modern electrical world that most people never think twice about using every single day. And then he spent his final years chasing ideas so unconventional that even his most devoted admirers still argue about how seriously to take them